something very specific happens in the accounts. The voice changes. Not just the tone, but the quality, as if a different person is suddenly speaking from the same throat. The person knows things they should not know. Things about the priest or healer standing in front of them, about events that happened far away, about the private lives of people in the room who have never spoken to them before. The physical strength becomes disproportionate, sometimes requiring several adults to restrain someone small and frail. And there is a particular and consistent reaction to the sacred, a recoiling, a rage, a recognition of something the person in their normal state would not necessarily recognize, that shows up in accounts separated by centuries and by oceans. Now here is the exact same list from a completely different tradition. A person in a severe dissociative crisis can speak in altered voices with distinct personalities. Paranoid states can include apparent knowledge of things the person should not know, sometimes later explained as information absorbed unconsciously and recalled in a distorted form. The physical agitation of someone in an extreme mental state can surprise everyone around them, and the content of certain psychological crises across many documented cases in many different countries frequently involves religious themes, an intense and often adversarial relationship with the sacred, with figures of divine authority, with ritual objects. The overlap is almost complete. This is the question that this history has been avoiding for centuries, and that neither side of the debate has been willing to sit with honestly. If what the spiritual traditions call possession and what medicine calls certain extreme psychological states produce almost identical observable symptoms, what does that actually tell us? Not about who is right, about what both sides are looking at. This is the history of exorcism, and the deeper you go, the less simple the answer becomes. The ritual itself is older than any religion that currently practices it. Texts from ancient Mesopotamia, some of the oldest written documents in human history, contain detailed instructions for driving out spirits that had taken up residence in human bodies. These texts describe specialists, trained practitioners who knew specific spoken formulas, specific materials, and a protocol for confronting the force inhabiting the person and compelling it to leave. The structure is recognizable to anyone who has ever seen a modern exorcism described. The basic architecture has not changed in 4,000 years. In ancient Egypt, priests trained specifically in what modern translators sometimes call magical medicine performed rituals designed to expel malevolent presences causing illness and behavioral change. The Ebers Papyrus, one of the oldest medical documents ever found, blends what we would now call pharmacological treatments with ritual expulsions in the same text, treating both as part of the same practice. The boundary between medicine and spiritual intervention did not exist in the way we draw it today. The question of whether an affliction had a physical or a spiritual cause was considered a diagnostic question, not a philosophical one. In India, the Atharva Veda, among the oldest of the sacred texts of the Vedic tradition, contains hymns specifically designed to drive out possessing spirits. The practice runs continuously from those ancient texts into the present. In Japan, the concept of spirit possession and the ritual practice of expelling unwanted presences is so deeply embedded in religious culture that it shaped entire art forms. The No theater, one of the oldest dramatic traditions in the world, is built substantially around the figure of spirits, bound to the living and the rituals required to release both the spirit and the person it inhabits. Across the indigenous traditions of the Americas, from the Amazon basin to the Arctic, healing practitioners have performed rituals structurally identical to what the Catholic Church calls exorcism, working within the understanding that certain human conditions arise when a foreign presence has entered the person, and that the healer's task is to identify, confront, and expel that presence, to restore the person to themselves. The universality is the thing that demands explanation. Either every human civilization independently arrived at the same mistaken interpretation of conditions that were actually neurological, without any contact with each other, or they were all responding to something that exists in human experience, something that their different frameworks were attempting to address in different languages. Both possibilities deserve to be taken seriously, and both are harder to dismiss than they initially appear. The question is not which framework is correct. The question is what they were all looking at, and what they were responding to in human experience that was consistent enough across all that distance and all those differences to produce the same basic ritual structure in every single one of them. In the New Testament, Jesus performs more acts of expelling unclean spirits than any other single category of action. If you count all 4 gospel accounts together, this is often overlooked in religious education because the healing miracles and the parables tend to receive more attention. But any honest reading of the Gospels as documents encounters these confrontations on nearly every page of the early chapters, and the pattern in those encounters is consistently strange in ways that reward careful reading rather than quick summary. The spirits recognize Jesus before his own disciples fully understand who he is. In the account of the man called Legion, in the Gospel of Mark, a severely disturbed man living in a cemetery outside the city, who could not be restrained and who wounded himself with stones. The possessing presence speaks first when Jesus approaches. It identifies Jesus with a theological precision that the human beings around him, including his own followers, did not yet have. Why would the gospel writers, if they were constructing a narrative designed to establish Jesus' authority, choose to have that authority confirmed by the entities he's about to expel? It is a strange literary choice unless the account is preserving something that actually happened. The spirits negotiate in that same account. They do not simply flee when confronted. They ask not to be sent out of the region. They request permission to enter a nearby herd of pigs. Jesus grants this. The animals run into the lake and drown. This is an uncomfortable detail that many readers skip past. Why is it in the text? Why would the gospel writers preserve the information that the expelled presences were permitted to relocate rather than simply destroyed or dissolved? What does it tell us about the nature of these beings, that they apparently needed to go somewhere rather than ceasing to exist? The early Christian community treated this kind of intervention as a normal and expected part of spiritual life. Paul lists the discernment and expulsion of spirits among the ordinary gifts of the Spirit in his letters, not in a special category of exceptional events. The early church had a recognized minor order called the exorcist, a designated role that existed before the tradition was formally elaborated into the ritual it became. The point is not that ancient people were credulous. The point is that this was not presented as exotic. It was presented as routine. That routine was eventually formalized into a ritual, systematized, authorized, and controlled by institutional hierarchy. The same process we have seen in every other chapter of this history. A practice that began as fluid and communal gradually acquired institutional management, official permission, specialized personnel, and theological gatekeeping. The rite of exorcism became a document. The exorcist became an official appointment. The spontaneous became bureaucratic. And as it became bureaucratic, it also became something that institutions could deploy, misuse, and eventually overdeploy. The history of exorcism being performed on people who were ill rather than spiritually disturbed is, in significant part, a history of what happens when the diagnosis is made by people with institutional authority and no medical training, in a context where the institutional authority was not equipped to be questioned. Now for the part of this history that is most difficult to discuss honestly, because it requires acknowledging hard truths in 2 directions simultaneously, and the temptation to only tell one of them is strong. The first hard truth is well established and must be stated clearly. For centuries, people with conditions that are now understood medically were subjected to exorcism rituals instead of treatment. People with epilepsy were treated as possessed because their seizures looked like a loss of control that fit the conceptual framework available. People experiencing severe psychotic breaks were subjected to rituals that at best did nothing and at worst caused serious physical and psychological harm. People with conditions we now recognize as producing distinct alternate states of consciousness were treated as multiply possessed when what they needed was medical care. The suffering caused by misidentifying these conditions as spiritual rather than neurological is documented across many centuries and many traditions, and any honest account of this history has to include it without softening. The second hard truth is less comfortable for the opposite audience, and it gets discussed far less frequently in mainstream contexts. There are documented cases, observed by trained medical professionals acting in the role of skeptical witnesses, that the available medical frameworks have not been able to satisfactorily explain, not because the observers chose to believe in possession, but because the specific phenomena they documented did not fit the patterns their training prepared them to explain. The case that became most influential in American culture is the one that directly inspired the novel and film The Exorcist. The actual events, involving a 14-year-old in Maryland and Washington in 1949, were recorded in a detailed diary kept by a Jesuit priest named Father Bot and witnessed by multiple people, including a psychiatrist who was present specifically to evaluate whether a natural explanation was available. The documented phenomena included physical events, witnessed simultaneously by multiple independent observers, the apparent demonstration of knowledge the person had no prior access to, and other occurrences that the psychiatrists present, according to the records, could not account for within his professional framework. He did not conclude that possession was the explanation. He also could not provide an alternative that covered everything he had witnessed. This single case does not prove a universal claim. Cases of this kind are inherently difficult to evaluate at historical distance, but it illustrates something that the honest version of this conversation requires, acknowledging the scientific framework has not definitively closed this question. The honest position is that the question remains open, and that anyone who tells you otherwise with complete confidence is overstating what the evidence currently supports. What neuroscience does contribute to this conversation, and contributes genuinely and significantly, is an understanding of why the symptoms overlap so completely. Temporal lobe epilepsy, a condition affecting a specific region of the brain involved in emotion, memory, and sensory processing, produces experiences that include intense religious feelings, a sense of overwhelming external presence, voices, states of altered consciousness, and in some cases the subjective experience that something outside the self has entered or is influencing the person. These are not poetic descriptions. They are documented, measurable, reproducible, neurological phenomena associated with specific patterns of brain activity. Extreme dissociation, which occurs along a spectrum of severity in response to trauma and other conditions, can in its most severe forms produce states in which what present themselves as entirely separate identities emerge with their own voices, names, and claimed memories. States that can be experienced as intrusions from outside the person's normal sense of self, and that can be startling to witnesses in ways that strongly resemble what historical accounts describe. This is not possession in any theological sense, but from the outside, in real time, without prior knowledge of the diagnosis, it can produce observations that are almost indistinguishable from what the old accounts document, what the neuroscience cannot currently explain. However, is why these states so consistently produce the same specific content across cultures that had no connection to each other. Why the religious themes are so recurrent across completely different religious traditions. Why the adversarial relationship with the sacred, specifically with the sacred, shows up so reliably. Why certain ritual responses, developed by traditions with no knowledge of each other, appear to produce observable effects that the purely neurological framework does not predict. This is not a gap that demands a theological explanation, but it is a gap that demands intellectual honesty. The question of why these states look the way they look, and why they respond to what they respond to, has not been fully answered by neuroscience, and anyone who implies otherwise is describing a more complete understanding than currently exists. The Catholic Church's formal position on this is, perhaps surprisingly to many people, quite careful and quite specific. The Catechism explicitly distinguishes between demonic influence and mental illness. It states that the Church appeals to medicine before diagnosing possession. The rite of exorcism, substantially updated in 1998, includes formal guidance on collaboration with medical professionals. Before a solemn exorcism may be performed, the Church's official position is that genuine cases of possession are rare, that the vast majority of apparent cases have natural explanations, and that a bishop's authorization is required before the formal rite may be used, specifically because the stakes of misidentification in either direction are serious. The institution that the popular imagination associates with medieval superstition about possession is, in its actual contemporary documents, more cautious about making the claim than most of its critics assume. In Islam, the concept of jinn, spiritual beings capable of interacting with, and in some cases, entering human beings, is theologically accepted across most of the tradition's schools. The practice of ruqya, the recitation of Quranic verses as a form of spiritual healing that can address cases of jinn presence, is widely practiced and represents a serious and carefully developed tradition within Islamic scholarship, like the Catholic framework. Islamic scholarship on this question explicitly distinguishes between cases requiring medical care and cases requiring spiritual intervention, and the serious practitioners in this area do not treat these as mutually exclusive. In the African diasporic traditions that developed in the Americas, the distinction between invited spiritual presence, the drawing of benevolent forces to work through a person, and uninvited intrusion, a presence that has attached itself to a person without consent and without benefit, is a foundational theological category. These traditions have developed sophisticated frameworks, refined across centuries of direct practice, for understanding when a person is experiencing something that needs spiritual guidance versus when something genuinely harmful has taken hold. The practitioners in these traditions would find the simple Western binary between medicine and exorcism inadequate in ways that might surprise both the psychiatrist and the Catholic priest. In every tradition that practices exorcism or spiritual expulsion of any kind, there is an implicit understanding that the person who is suffering is not identical to what is happening to them, that there is something authentic in the person that is distinct from what has invaded or overwhelmed or disrupted them, that the person is, in some meaningful sense, more than what is currently expressing itself through them, and that the goal of any genuine intervention is not to judge or punish whatever the invading presence is, but to restore to the person something that is properly theirs, something that is more fundamentally them than what is currently in control. This is a statement about human dignity as much as it is a statement about spiritual reality. The human being, in these frameworks, has a legitimate claim to their own inner life. There is a real you that is distinct from every crisis, every disruption, every state in which you feel you are not yourself. The capacity of a human being to be overwhelmed by something that is not them, whatever the nature of that something, is treated as a genuine vulnerability that demands a genuine response from the community around them. And notice what that response always looks like across all these different traditions. The practitioner enters the situation with authority. The community witnesses, and what is declared in one language or another is this: you are not this. Whatever is happening through you is not who you are. You are still there, and we are here to help you return to yourself. That is not a primitive belief. That is one of the most humanizing affirmations that any community can make to a person who has lost their way back to themselves. And that affirmation, whatever the theological explanation behind it, appears to have genuine effect. The ritual context, the authority of the practitioner, the belief of the community gathered, the declaration that the person is worth recovering. All of these produce something that functions as healing, whether or not the metaphysical explanation is the correct one. And here is the question that this history, taken seriously from beginning to end, finally arrives at. Why does losing yourself, in whatever form that takes, feel like the worst possible thing? Why is the experience of no longer being the author of your own thoughts and actions so universally recognized as terrible in every culture, in every period? Why do human beings across every tradition consistently treat the recovery of that authorship as worth extraordinary effort? Perhaps because there is something in you that is genuinely worth recovering, something that is you in a way that goes deeper than any state that can be imposed on you from outside, something that exists before the crisis and persists through it and remains available on the other side of it, something that cannot be permanently extinguished, no matter how completely it has been covered over. Traditions have many names for this: the soul, the spirit, the image of God in the human person, the deepest ground of who you are. Whatever name you give it, the consistent teaching across the traditions that take this question seriously is that this thing is real, that it can be threatened and overwhelmed and made temporarily inaccessible, and that its recovery is always possible, that you cannot be so far gone that you are unreachable. That is a vision of the human being that does not require you to accept any particular theological framework to find meaningful. It requires only that you believe you are worth coming back to. And perhaps it requires asking, once, the question that exorcism in every tradition was ultimately built around. What is the thing in you that is most fully you? And what would it take to return to it when something else has taken over the space? If that sense of finding your way back to who you actually are, beneath everything that has clouded or disrupted or overwhelmed your sense of yourself, speaks to something you have been looking for. That is the territory the ebook Reconnecting with Your Divine Essence was written to navigate with you, not a formula. A companion for the return. The link is in the description. And the final question that this history leaves open, for anyone willing to sit with it. What if possession and certain forms of what we call extreme psychological distress look so similar, not because one is a misunderstanding of the other, but because both are experiences of the same underlying human reality? The terrifying possibility of no longer being the author of yourself. And what if every culture that has ever taken that possibility seriously enough to develop a ritual response to it was doing something genuinely important, regardless of whether we can agree on why it happens? Not getting the answer exactly right, but refusing to look away from exactly the right question.